The father of stylish action, Hideki Kamiya is a Japanese video game designer and director behind many iconic games and franchises. His innovative approach to game design, mastery of fluid combat mechanics, and unique storytelling have made him one of the most influential figures in gaming today. Yet he remains someone I find to be quite slept on in mainstream culture, a man not talked about enough compared to other developers, but for those who know of his influence on gaming. For a while now, Kamiya has been laying low with over 10 years passing since his last directed game, but recently, at the 2024 Game Awards, it was announced that there will be an upcoming sequel to one of Kamiya's previous gems, with him back in the saddle again. So I thought now would be the perfect time to revisit all of his past directed games and make a ranking from least favorite to masterpiece.
Wonderful 101!
Released exclusively on the Wii U in 2013, The Wonderful 101 was a niche game on an already niche console, so if you haven't heard of this before, then I don't blame you. The game follows a group of 101 ordinary citizens who transform into superheroes to protect Earth from an alien invasion. The game features chaotic mechanics and a vibrant comic book inspired art style reminiscent of another Kamiya game, Beautiful Joe, more on that later. The Wonderful 101 had some big ideas, with its most distinctive one being the Unite morphing system. This system gives you the ability to draw shapes on the Wii U's touchscreen or with the right analog stick to combine the heroes into different forms of weapons. Although the idea and execution were fun to play with at the start, it slowly grew repetitive using the same few powers over and over again. Keep in mind, this game takes around 15 plus hours to complete, so getting through this with somewhat limited gameplay was a slog at times. The game could have been trimmed down with its pacing tightened, and maybe then the gameplay loop wouldn't have ended up feeling as repetitive as it did, but making it to that wild finale kinda made it worth it. Overall, The Wonderful 101 is by no means a bad game. It's a very solid experience with bold and creative ideas, but caters towards a very niche audience. A bizarre project with some flaws, fitting for a bizarre console with some flaws of its own.
Joe, honey, why don't you show me some off-screen action?
Beautiful Joe is a super distinctive looking game to me. I vividly remember trying this game as a child, but quickly dropping it due to how unforgiving it was, but that art style, stuck with me forever. The story follows a teenage cinephile named Joe, who takes his girlfriend Sylvia to see a film featuring his favorite hero, Captain Blue. During the movie, an evil looking bad guy reaches out from the screen and kidnaps Sylvia, pulling her into the movie. Joe is then dragged in as well and encounters Captain Blue, who grants Joe a gizmo called the V-Watch, which allows him to transform into the superhero Beautiful Joe. Hideki Kamiya is a big fan of cinema, especially action and tokusatsu films. He wanted to pay homage to these genres while pushing the boundaries of game design. His goal was to create an experience that felt like playing inside one of these movies using cinematic effects like slow motion and fast forward, which weren't really seen in games during that period. Even to this day, I think these mechanics have aged gracefully and still hold up over 20 years later. Though unique in concept and style, the gameplay can be unreasonably frustrating. There is a steep learning curve with roller coaster like level of difficulty that turn what looks like a cute and welcoming game into a low-key controller smasher. For example, later in the game there's a chapter that puts you through a gauntlet of the last 4 bosses you faced, before having to take on the hardest boss so far. But if you bite down and work through it, the game becomes a very rewarding experience that's relatively short from start to finish. There is some replayability with harder difficulties that unlock after completing, but in the end, Beautiful Joe is pretty limited in substance. I still had a lot of fun with this one, even if it was a bit rough at times, and it did remind me of a simpler and sweeter time, so I'll give it a plus for that. Beautiful Joe is an exciting and super stylish game that feels like a passion project of Kamiya's love for cinema. After years of creative differences and butting heads with Capcom, the company Kamiya worked for at the time, he decided to venture out and try something new. Once leaving, he and other legendary game developers co-founded a new game studio called Platinum Games, where they would operate independently. At Platinum Games, with a lot more creative freedom, Hideki Kamiya was able to go full Hideki Kamiya. His first project at this new studio was of course Bayonetta. The game follows the titular character Bayonetta, a powerful witch who awakens after a 500-year slumber with no memory of who or what she is. As she tries to uncover the truth about her past, she soon realizes just how deep the rabbit hole goes and discovers that she is far more important than she ever imagined. Umbra witches, light and darkness, cosmic battles, Bayonetta's story is batshit crazy and is something you'd have to try and puzzle together yourself as you play through it. But let's be real, Bayonetta wasn't ever recognized or played for its story. The gameplay is its selling point and it delivers hard. The game is peak stylish action, Kamiya's bread and butter. The combat is fluid, satisfying to execute with fun mechanics sprinkled in, like dodging an enemy's attack at the right moment would trigger witch time, which would just slow time down like we previously saw in Beautiful Joe. Attacks were cancelable and inputs were very responsive. My favorite part of it all is the execution-like mechanic that reminded me of heat actions from the Yakuza franchise. And the soundtrack on top of it all was just fabulous. I loved the jazz. All in all, Bayonetta was completely unapologetic in every way. Kamiya fully embraced the over-the-top action, the sexualized protagonist, absurd storytelling, and campy humor without hesitation. But like with most ambitious creations, it has its flaws. Bayonetta shows signs of its times. The game has a lot of quick-time events, some of which would lead to an insta-death that would affect your level score if you were going for that. Also, even for such a wacky game, some sections felt completely out of left field, and these segments just went on for way too long. Don't get me started on the first half of chapter 14, but the flaws aren't that deep and don't completely affect the overall experience. At the end of the day, Kamiya did it again by delivering another staple in the stylish action genre and created another iconic character and franchise. Bayonetta is a must-play for those that are a fan of his style. Released in 2006 for the PS2 at the end of its life cycle, Okami flew completely under the radar and is what I consider a forgotten masterpiece. The story follows Amaterasu, the sun goddess, in the form of a white wolf, tasked to restore and bring life back to the land of Japan after it's been overrun by darkness. Inspired by The Legend of Zelda, Kamiya wanted to create a game in the same vein as the legendary Nintendo franchise. The way the progression and world building were structured and the sense of discovery were both inspired by the Zelda games and were heavily felt in the world of Okami. Despite these notable inspirations, Okami still stands firm on its own four legs, with many ideas unique to its own. Visually, Okami has the most beautiful use of cel shading that I've seen in gaming. Initially, Kamiya wanted Okami to have a more realistic art style before having to shift to cel shading due to hardware limitations, and I'm glad they did, as Okami is now synonymous with this style. On a side note, I played this on an emulator, and even then I still found it to be visually stunning, even with the ghosting and resolution. Artistic expression was a big theme Kamiya wanted with Okami, and in terms of gameplay he emphasized this with the celestial brush mechanic. As Amaterasu, the player is given the ability to bring out the celestial brush and paint symbols to attack enemies, manipulate nature, and solve puzzles. This mechanic was a lot of fun to combo and mess around with, and although it really tested my ability in having to draw a simple circle with an analog stick, I still found it to be a really cool and unique feature. In terms of storytelling, the world building was amazing, with a lot of beautiful locations and a stunning soundtrack to accompany it all. A lot of characters in this world were quirky and memorable that I just loved to interact with, especially Isun, your companion who was with you throughout the entire ride. At first I thought he'd be annoying like Navi, but Isun grew on me a lot the more the story progressed, and I ended up really loving that little shithead by the end of it. Okami gives you plenty of time to grow with its world and characters, as it's a dense game which took me around 40 plus hours to complete. However, those 40 plus hours definitely felt like 40 plus hours, which brings me on a downside. It's a slow ass game. Right off the bat, the second you press start for the first time, you're locked in a 10-minute intro describing the world through text, since by the way, there's no voice acting in this game, so all dialogue sounds like it's being yapped at you by an Animal Crossing villager. And it's not just the opening. Throughout the game, dialogue and cutscenes can drag on, making it feel slower than it needs to be. That said, its pacing is a double-edged sword. On one hand, it gives you time to soak in the world and grow attached to the characters. On the other, it makes the game feel every bit as long as it is, which isn't always a good thing. Even as a big Yakuza fan, I can say it gets a bit much. Aside from the slow opening and minor pacing issues, Okami is still a piece of art that I consider to be a masterpiece of the 6th generation console. Flawed and forgotten, but still a masterpiece nonetheless.
Ada!
The directorial debut of Hideki Kamiya, and he came out swinging, but so did the development process, swinging right back at him. Resident Evil 2 was no easy fight to finish, and I feel the need to give some backstory on the development since it really adds context and emphasizes what makes Kamiya so legendary as a game director. To quickly summarize, after Shinji Mikami, the director of Resident Evil 1, wrapped up his work on the survival horror classic, Capcom immediately pushed for a sequel. Kamiya, who had worked as Shinji Mikami's protege on Resident Evil 1, was personally chosen by Mikami himself to direct the follow-up. Mikami saw the potential in Kamiya and said to him, and I quote, "You are the dark horse of the new recruits. You're either going to fail spectacularly, or you're going to be a huge success." And shockingly enough, Kamiya went on to do both in one game. Resident Evil 2 being his first time directing, his inexperience showed during development. If it wasn't obvious by now, Kamiya is a big action guy, and his goal with RE2 was to make it bigger, dramatic, and more action oriented, but his first iteration of this ended up leaning too heavily on those themes and lacked a strong narrative and any emotional depth or atmosphere. Mikami tested this early prototype and said that it was boring and dull. Imagine your mentor saying that to you on your debut project. This culminated in RE2 being completely scrapped, and the team at Capcom led by Kamiya had to start from scratch. This scrapped version ended up becoming known as Resident Evil 1.5. With morale low, the inner Capcom team that was under Kamiya's direction went to Shinji Mikami and asked him to replace Kamiya for his inexperience. Mikami stood firm on his belief in the young director and gave Kamiya a second and most likely final chance. So with development restarting, Shinji Mikami brought in TV show writer Noboru Sugimura to help Kamiya rewrite the entire story and improve on the lacking narrative. Mikami would then take a backseat role as supervisor, overseeing game design and quality control. And finally, Kamiya, still in the directing chair, had to prove to himself, his mentor Shinji Mikami, and the inner team at Capcom that he was the man to deliver the project home. And good God almighty did he persevere. The story begins with rookie cop Leon as Kennedy and college student Claire Redfield arriving in Raccoon City only to find it overrun by zombies due to a virus outbreak. Separated in the mayhem, they both make their way to the Raccoon City Police Department, or RPD, where the horrors of their night have only begun. With two protagonists, Resident Evil 2 introduces an interesting concept with a scenario system that was heavily marketed as the game's biggest selling point. You can either start your first playthrough or Scenario A with Leon or Claire, then once completed, Scenario B is unlocked where you play as the character you didn't choose. Kamiya and the team introduced the scenario structure with something called the zapping system. This system, in theory, would carry over actions taken in Scenario A to affect Scenario B, like item placements, door access, and enemy placements. While ambitious for its time, it didn't really work as effectively as intended. Both Scenario A and B often repeated the same major events, bosses, set pieces, and puzzles, leading to plot holes where the same moments seemed to happen twice. Besides the zapping system not really working, which wasn't even a big deal for me, I honestly have no other flaws or gripes with OG RE2. It perfected the formula introduced in the first game by being more refined in every way. Its pacing and level design was much smoother to navigate. The way the set locations intertwined was butter, and the setting of the RPD was just as interesting to explore as the Spencer Mansion. The expanded story and characters were much deeper, introducing the franchise's most iconic figures, Leon, Claire, Ada, and Hunk. The pre-rendered backgrounds were more detailed, cutscenes were more cinematic, and the sound design was insanely atmospheric. No mansion basement here. Basically, the presentation and scale was significantly larger in every way. I mean, it's like Terminator 2 or Aliens in the gaming world. Its predecessor was a slow, methodically paced thriller with body horror and creepy elements, to the sequel going harder with adrenaline pumping, blood surging, high-octane action, while also delivering a deep and meaningful story. Hideki Kamiya, again, big action guy, wanted his sequel to Resident Evil to be like these Hollywood movies that he admired so greatly. After failing the first time and learning from those mistakes, this time he was able to properly implement the Hollywood-style action he so greatly desired, and that he did. Resident Evil 2 was released in 1998 for the PlayStation 1 and was widely praised by critics and audience alike. Resident Evil is my favorite franchise of all time, and OG RE2 for me is easily top 3 in the series. It is one of the most influential games in the survival horror genre and gaming in general, but it is not as influential as the Firestarter Kamiya would release only 3 years later.
Want to fill your dark soul with light!
Impressed by Hideki Kamiya's work on Resident Evil 2, Shinji Mikami quickly entrusted him with directing the up-and-coming Resident Evil 4. But Kamiya took an entirely left turn from the usual Resident Evil formula and went for a game heavily focused on stylish combat and high-intensity action. Capcom didn't agree with this new direction for the survival horror franchise and thought it strayed too far from Resident Evil's traditional elements. Rather than discard the project entirely, Capcom saw value in the concept and acknowledged that Kamiya's team was onto something unique. Kamiya and his team were removed from turning that project into RE4 and were instead given the opportunity to develop it as its own IP. This new IP became Devil May Cry, aka the pioneer of the stylish action genre, the big daddy of the hack and slash, the game to spawn one of the most iconic franchises that's still going till this day. Devil May Cry was released in 2001 for the PS2 and follows the story of Dante, a half-human, half-demon who runs a shop called Devil May Cry, a shop and base of operations where he takes on contracts to take out demons for a price. One day, a woman named Trish barges through the front door to let Dante know that the powerful demon lord that killed his mother has returned and is planning on conquering the human world. Trish then leads Dante to a massive gothic castle on an island where Dante must journey through to find revenge and possibly some closure of his origins. Devil May Cry is fairly straightforward in terms of core plot, but the story features complexity to it with many twists and turns. But just like Bayonetta, and pretty much all the games talked about so far, Hideki Kamiya's games are not highlighted by its storytelling. Devil May Cry basically invented the hack and slash genre that we know today. Released in 2001, it was beyond its time in terms of gameplay depth. The combat was fast, fluid, and had a heavy emphasis on acrobatics. Though games like Tekken or Street Fighter had similar combat mechanics, Devil May Cry brought these ideas of seamless combo-heavy action to a 3D 3D action-adventure space. This implementation was revolutionary at the time and became a defining feature of the game. Animation canceling, juggling, and combos must have been mind-blowing for people in 2001 to experience in a 3D game that wasn't a fighter. Aside from its one-of-a-kind gameplay mechanics, DMC hits it out of the park in every other aspect. I adored the gothic and demonic settings, which to me were reminiscent of Berserk. Like, just look at the orbs and tell me that these aren't behelots. The enemy variation felt pretty deep, especially for its time, and the bosses for the most part were well designed. Dante, the protagonist, became instantly memorable with his design, who was just the perfect frontman to lead Hideki Kamiya's stylish action genre. Unfortunately, by today's standards, it has aged in some ways, mainly the camera and controls that felt super janky and stiff at times. But this game was the first of its kind though, so these issues are forgiven in my book, and I'll just chalk it up as some early PS2 janky charm. Devil May Cry is essential to understanding the Hideki Kamiya vision. He kicked off an entire subgenre with his idea to make action stylish, and he did exactly that with this game. It paved the way for many future iconic games like God of War, Ninja Gaiden, Metal Gear Rising, and of course Bayonetta. Devil May Cry is the perfect encapsulation of everything Kamiya stands for in his philosophy of game design, and it laid the groundwork for all that came after in his career. So that's my ranking. Hideki Kamiya is a legend, and I'm beyond stoked that he's returning to direct again after 10 plus years since his last. All we got was just an announcement for the Okami sequel, no time window or anything, so I can imagine it won't be released till the next console generation. Probably eons away, but still, I just can't wait to see what Hideki Kamiya will cook up with modern hardware. He stated that he never liked doing sequels and just wanted to create new IPs, which is respectable, but after Okami 2, maybe this will be the start of him possibly revisiting his other franchises, maybe another DMC? I don't know, highly unlikely, but a man can only dream.